On the windswept Dakota prairie, a woman in white lace struggles against the dying light. Melody Crane, 54 and abandoned at the altar, fights to kindle a fire in an empty sod house while her wedding dress grows stiff with frost. Her younger suitor fled when he discovered she brought no land, no money, only the promise of companionship through the harsh frontier winters ahead. Holloway, a weathered cattle scout of 60, spots her desperate efforts from the trail. His own heart carries the weight of loss, his wife buried 3 winters past beneath the unforgiving prairie soil. Something in Melody's solitary figure speaks to the loneliness he's carried like stones in his saddlebags. When Grant dismounts to help coax flames from her frozen kindling, neither expects the warmth that follows not just from the fire, but from 2 souls finding unexpected shelter in each other's presence. But can 2 hearts scarred by abandonment and grief truly find the courage to trust again? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled like a living thing across the Dakota territory, carrying with it the promise of a blizzard that would bury the prairie in white silence. Melody Crane's fingers had long since lost feeling as she crouched beside the meager pile of kindling outside the sod house, her wedding dress once pristine ivory lace stained with mud and tears. The fabric, which she had spent 3 months sewing by lamplight, believing it would carry her into a new life, now felt like a shroud in the gathering dusk. She struck another match, the 4th one from her dwindling supply, and watched the tiny flame flicker against the prairie wind before dying. The irony wasn't lost on her woman who had spent her life tending fires in other people's homes, cooking meals and keeping hearths warm, now couldn't manage to light one when her very survival depended on it. "Come on," she whispered to the stubborn kindling, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. "Please." The memory of Thomas Whitmore's face when she'd confessed the truth still burned fresh in her mind. She could see it clearly, the way his eager expression had crumbled when she'd admitted there was no dowry, no inheritance, no parcel of land to sweeten their union. Just her, 54 years old, with calloused hands and a heart that had waited too long for love. "I thought you understood," she had said, standing in the very spot where she now struggled with the matches. "I told you I had little to offer but myself." His laugh had been cruel, cutting through the autumn air like a blade. "A woman your age, with nothing? I'd be better off taking a wife from the saloons in Deadwood." The sound of hoofbeats had barely registered through her humiliation as he'd mounted his horse and ridden away, leaving her standing there in the dress she'd made for their wedding, surrounded by the few belongings she'd brought from her sister's house in Minnesota. Now, 3 hours later, as the temperature dropped and the first fat snowflakes began to fall, Melody wondered if Thomas had done her a favor. Better to discover his true nature now than after vows had been spoken and her fate sealed to a man who saw her as nothing more than a business transaction. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her look up from her futile efforts with the kindling. Through the gathering darkness, she could make out the silhouette of a rider, his horse moving at a steady pace along the trail that ran past her Thomas's property. She quickly turned away, not wanting to be seen in her current state, a woman alone and clearly struggling. But the hoofbeats slowed, then stopped entirely. "Ma'am?" The voice was deep, weathered by years and wind, but gentle. "Are you in need of assistance?" Melody's first instinct was to claim she was fine, to maintain what little dignity she had left. But the wind chose that moment to gust harder, scattering her small pile of kindling and extinguishing the tiny spark she'd finally managed to coax from the tinder. She turned toward the rider, and in the dim light she could see he was a tall man, broad-shouldered beneath a heavy coat, his face shadowed by the brim of a worn hat. Something in his posture suggested patience, as if he had nowhere urgent to be, and all the time in the world to wait for her answer. "I'm having some difficulty with the fire," she admitted, her voice barely carrying over the wind. Without a word, the man dismounted, his movements economical and sure. He led his horse closer and pulled a battered tin pot from his saddlebags, along with a small burlap sack, Grant Holloway, he said by way of introduction, touching the brim of his hat. And you'd be? Melody Crane. She hesitated, then added, I was to be married today. If Grant noticed the past tense, he didn't comment on it. Instead, he knelt beside her scattered kindling and began sorting through the pieces with practiced hands. Wind's tricky out here, he said, his tone conversational. Takes a particular touch to get a fire going when she's blowing like this. He moved with the efficiency of a man who had spent years making camps in hostile weather. From his coat pocket, he produced a small bundle of dry bark and what looked like cotton batting. Birch bark, he explained, noticing her curious gaze. Keeps dry even in the worst weather, and this here's char cloth catches a spark easier than anything else. Within minutes, he had a small but steady flame, growing in a depression he'd scraped in the dirt, sheltered by a ring of larger stones. The sight of it brought tears to Melody's eyes, not from the smoke, but from the sheer relief of warmth and light in the gathering darkness. Thank you, she whispered. Grant fed the fire carefully, adding increasingly larger pieces of wood as the flames grew stronger. Got coffee in this pot? He said, holding up the tin container. Water's fresh from the creek about a mile back. Figured I'd make camp soon anyway, this storm's going to be a hard one. Melody looked toward the sod house, its single room barely large enough for one person, let alone two. But the alternative, watching this kind stranger ride away into the blizzard, seemed suddenly unbearable. You're welcome to shelter here, she said, then quickly added, I mean, there's not much room, but it's better than being caught in the open. Grant's weathered face creased into what might have been a smile. Appreciate the offer, ma'am. Been riding since dawn, and my horse could use the rest. He paused, studying her face in the firelight. You sure you don't mind the company? There was something in his tone that suggested he understood more about her situation than she'd told him. Perhaps it was the wedding dress, or the way she'd been alone with her struggles, or simply the recognition that passed between two people who had both known loneliness. I'd welcome it, she said honestly. As if summoned by their words, the wind picked up again, driving the first serious snow of the blizzard horizontal across the prairie. Grant quickly gathered more firewood from a pile stacked against the sod house. Thomas's preparation for a winter he wouldn't be spending here and helped Melody move the fire closer to the door. Inside the small dwelling, the space was cramped but warm. Thomas had built it as a temporary shelter while he proved up his claim, planning to construct a proper frame house come spring. Now it would serve as refuge for two strangers thrown together by circumstance and weather. Grant busied himself with the coffee, filling his battered tin pot with snow and setting it near the fire to melt. The pot itself was a thing of beauty in its simplicity, dented and blackened by countless fires, with a handle wrapped in leather that had been worn smooth by years of use. That's a well-traveled pot, Melody observed, settling onto one of the two rough stools Thomas had made. Belonged to my wife, Grant said quietly. She always said coffee tasted better from tin than china, said it reminded her we were free to go anywhere we pleased. The past tense wasn't lost on Melody. Was she right about the coffee? Grant measured grounds from a small sack, his movements deliberate and careful. Haven't found anything to prove her wrong yet. He glanced up at her. She passed 3 winters ago. Fever took her quick. I'm sorry. She lived full, Grant said simply. Can't ask for more than that. They sat in comfortable silence as the coffee heated, the storm building in intensity outside. Through the single oiled paper window, Melody could see the snow beginning to accumulate, and she felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. You're intended, Grant said eventually, his tone careful. He coming back? Melody shook her head. He found out I had no dowry, no land or money to bring to the marriage, decided he'd rather take his chances elsewhere. His loss. The simple statement, delivered without pity or false comfort, somehow meant more than any elaborate consolation could have. Grant poured the coffee into 2 tin cups, handing one to Melody with the same courtesy he might have shown a lady in the finest parlor. The coffee was strong and bitter, but it warmed her from the inside out. As she sipped it, she found herself studying her unlikely companion. He was a handsome man, Dispitior, perhaps because of the lines that years of weather and hard living had etched around his eyes. His hair was more silver than brown, and his hands bore the calluses of someone who worked with them daily. But there was something else about him, a quality of stillness and watchfulness that suggested depths she couldn't yet fathom. "What brings you through this territory?" she asked. "Scout for cattle drives," Grant replied. "Check water sources, grass conditions, weather patterns, making one last sweep before winter sets in hard. Dangerous work, traveling alone. Been doing it most of my life, know the country pretty well by now." He sipped his coffee, then added, "Though I'll admit, this storm caught me by surprise. Should have been at the fort by now." Outside, the wind howled with increasing fury, and they could hear the snow beginning to pile against the door. Whatever Grant's original plans had been, it was clear he wouldn't be traveling anywhere until the storm passed. "Tell me about Minnesota," he said, settling back against the wall. "What brought you west?" And so, as the blizzard raged outside their small shelter, Melody found herself telling this stranger about her life, how she'd kept house for her sister's family after her sister's husband died, how she'd answered Thomas's advertisement for a bride, partly out of loneliness and partly out of hope for something more than being a perpetual maiden aunt. Grant listened without judgment, occasionally asking a question that showed he was truly paying attention. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Takes courage," he said finally, "to leave everything familiar behind for the promise of something better. Or foolishness. Sometimes they're the same thing." The storm continued to build outside, but inside their small refuge, warmed by fire and coffee and the unexpected comfort of understanding company, Melody felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a sense of safety that had nothing to do with walls or doors and everything to do with the quiet strength of the man sitting across from her. As the night deepened and the coffee pot emptied, they talked about small things, the beauty of the prairie in summer, the challenges of frontier life, the way the land could break a person's spirit or forge it into something stronger than steel. And gradually, Melody began to understand that Grant Holloway was a man who had known both the breaking and the forging, and had emerged from the experience with his essential kindness intact. When exhaustion finally began to claim them both, Grant insisted on taking the floor near the fire, leaving Melody the single narrow bed. As she lay listening to the storm and the steady breathing of her unexpected guardian, she reflected on the strange turns life could take. This morning she had been a bride. Tonight she was a woman alone with a stranger in a blizzard, yet somehow she felt less alone than she had in months. Perhaps, she thought as sleep began to claim her, abandonment and rescue could sometimes be the same thing. The morning sun revealed a world transformed by snow, the prairie stretching endlessly white beneath a crystalline blue sky. Grant had risen before dawn to tend the fire and make fresh coffee, moving quietly so as not to wake Melody. When she emerged from the small bedroom area, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders, she found him studying a collection of papers spread across the rough wooden table. "Good morning," she said, accepting the cup of coffee he offered. "What have you found there?" Grant's expression was troubled. "These were tucked inside that Bible on the shelf. Looks like legal documents." He gestured to the papers. "Ma'am, did you know your intended owned this land?" Melody frowned, moving closer to examine the documents. Her father had taught her to read well, and as her eyes scanned the official language, her confusion deepened. "These papers say the land belongs to me. That can't be right." "Your name's right here." Grant pointed to a line in the deed. "Melody Rose Crane, inherited from one Marcus Crane, deceased. Says here it's 1,000 acres of prime grazing land, with water rights to Willow Creek." The coffee cup trembled in Melody's hands. "My father's name was Marcus, but I never knew he owned land out here. He died when I was 16, and Mother said he left us nothing but debts." Grant studied the documents more carefully. According to this, the land was purchased in 1862, just after the Homestead Act passed. Your father must have filed the claim and proved it up, but something prevented him from ever coming west to work it. A chill ran down Melody's spine that had nothing to do with the morning cold. "Thomas knew," she whispered. "He had to have known." "Seems likely. Question is, why didn't he tell you?" Before Melody could answer, the sound of approaching horses carried across the snow-muffled landscape. Grant moved to the window, his hand instinctively moving to rest on the handle of a long knife at his belt. "3 riders," he said quietly, "coming fast." Melody joined him at the window and felt her heart sink. Even at a distance, she recognized Thomas Whitmore's distinctive brown coat and the way he sat his horse. The 2 men with him were strangers, rough-looking men, with the hard faces of those who lived by violence. "It's Thomas," she said. "My former intended." Grant's expression hardened. "He's got company." The riders pulled up in front of the sod house, and Thomas dismounted with an arrogant swagger that made Melody's stomach turn. She could see now that the men with him wore guns prominently displayed, and their eyes swept the area with the practiced alertness of hired gunmen. "Melody," Thomas called out, his voice carrying false cheer. "Come on out here, darling. We need to have ourselves a talk." Grant stepped closer to Melody, his voice low. "Stay behind me, and whatever happens, don't admit to knowing about that land deed." Thomas's patience lasted exactly 30 seconds. When no one emerged from the house, his tone shifted to something uglier. "I know you're in there, Melody. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Grant opened the door but remained in the doorway, his large frame blocking most of the view into the house. "Morning," he said pleasantly. "Something I can help you with?" Thomas's eyes narrowed as he took in Grant's weathered appearance and confident bearing. "Who might you be, friend?" "Grant Holloway. Caught in the storm last night. The lady was kind enough to offer shelter." "The lady," Thomas said with a sneer, "owes me money. Wedding expenses, you understand. Cost me plenty to arrange our little ceremony, and when she ran off like she did—" "I didn't run off," Melody said, stepping into view behind Grant. "You left me here." Thomas's false smile stretched wider. "Now, honey, we both know that's not how it happened. You got cold feet and disappeared before the ceremony. Left me looking like a fool in front of the whole territory." One of the gunmen, a lean man with pale eyes and a scar across his jaw, spoke up. "Mr. Whitmore, we haven't got all day." "Right." Thomas's expression hardened. "Here's how this is going to work, Melody. You're going to sign over the deed to this property to cover what you owe me. Fair compensation for my troubles." Grant felt Melody tense behind him. "What deed would that be?" he asked mildly. "Don't play games with me, mister. We all know she owns this land. Her daddy bought it fair and square, and now it's hers. Worth a pretty penny too, with water rights and all." "Seems like important information to share with a prospective bride," Grant observed. "Wonder why a man wouldn't mention such a thing." The second gunman, older and heavier than his companion, shifted in his saddle. "Boss, the weather's turning again. We need to wrap this up." Thomas pulled a folded document from his coat. "I've got a bill of sale right here, all legal and proper. Just needs Melody's signature, and we can all go about our business." "And if she doesn't sign?" Grant asked. The pale-eyed gunman's hand moved closer to his pistol. "Then she might find frontier life more dangerous than she bargained for." Grant stepped fully outside, his movement casual but somehow menacing. In the bright morning light, Melody could see he was taller and broader than she'd realized, and there was something in his bearing that made even the armed men shift uneasily. "See, here's the problem with that thinking," Grant said conversationally. "Lady owns the land fair and square, by right of inheritance. Man tries to force her to sign it over under threat. Well, that's theft, and out here, theft of that magnitude is a hanging offense." Thomas's face flushed red. "You don't know what you're messing with, stranger. I've got friends in this territory. Important friends." "So do I," Grant replied. "Difference is, mine wear badges." The pale-eyed gunman's hand twitched toward his weapon, but Grant's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Wouldn't recommend it, son. Been handling problems like you since before you were weaned." Something in Grant's tone, quiet, certain, utterly without fear, made the gunman's hand freeze. The older gunman leaned forward in his saddle, studying Grant with new interest. "You got a name that might mean something?" the older man asked. "Might," Grant said. "Depends on who's asking and why." Thomas looked between his hired guns and Grant, frustration building in his voice. "I don't care who he is. Melody, you sign that paper right now, or I'll make sure you regret it." "No." Melody's voice was quiet but steady as she stepped out to stand beside Grant. "I won't sign anything. This is my land, and you have no claim to it." "Your land?" Thomas laughed harshly. "What's a dried-up spinster like you going to do with 1,000 acres? You need a man to work it, to protect it. Sign it over to me, and I'll give you enough money to get back to Minnesota where you belong." Or, the pale-eyed gunman added softly, "Accidents happen. Storms, fires, wild animals, dangerous country for a woman alone." Grant's hand moved to rest on the handle of his knife, and suddenly the morning air seemed charged with possibility. "Getting crowded out here," he said pleasantly. "Might be time for some folks to move along." Thomas looked at his hired guns, clearly expecting them to act. But both men were studying Grant with the wariness of predators who had suddenly realized they might be facing something more dangerous than they'd bargained for. "This isn't over," Thomas said finally, his voice tight with frustration. "Melody, you think about what I said. Winter's coming, and this is hard country. You'll change your mind soon enough." He mounted his horse with angry, jerky movements, and the three riders wheeled away across the snow-covered prairie. But Melody noticed that the pale-eyed gunman looked back twice, his gaze fixed on Grant with unmistakable calculation. As the sound of hoofbeats faded, Melody felt her knees go weak. Grant caught her arm, steadying her with gentle strength. "They'll be back," she said. "Yes," Grant agreed. "They will. Question is, what are you going to do about it?" Melody looked at the deed papers scattered across the table, then at the man who had stood between her and danger without hesitation. "I don't know," she admitted. "I never wanted to own land. I just wanted—" "What did you want?" "A home, someone to share it with, a life that meant something." Grant was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. "Might be those things aren't mutually exclusive," he said finally. "You've got good land here. Water, grass, defensible position. Could build something lasting if a person had the will for it. And the knowledge. And the strength. And the courage." Melody shook her head. "I'm a 54-year-old woman who spent her life keeping other people's houses. What do I know about ranching or fighting off land grabbers? More than you think, probably. And what you don't know, you can learn." Grant paused, then added quietly, "If you had the right partner." The words hung in the cold air between them, full of possibility and promise. Melody felt something stir in her chest knot, the desperate hope she'd felt with Thomas, but something steadier and stronger. "Are you offering to help me, Mr. Holloway?" "I'm offering to stay," Grant said simply. "For as long as you'll have me, see what we can build together." Outside, the wind was picking up again, bringing with it the scent of more snow. But inside the small sod house, looking at the deed papers that represented both threat and opportunity, Melody felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the sense that her real life was just beginning. 3 days after Thomas's threatening visit, Grant emerged from the small storage shed behind the sod house, carrying something wrapped in oiled canvas. Melody looked up from the fence post. She was trying to secure a task that had proven more challenging than anticipated, and watched him approach with curiosity. "What have you got there?" she asked, wiping sweat from her brow, despite the cold morning air. Grant unwrapped the canvas to reveal a cavalry saber, its blade showing the careful maintenance of years, but also the nicks and scratches of hard use. The brass guard was tarnished but solid, and leather wrapped the grip in a pattern that spoke of military precision. "Figured it was time you knew more about who you're partnering with," he said, setting the weapon across 2 fence posts like a makeshift table. "Served 22 years in the cavalry. This was issued to me when I made sergeant, and I carried it through most of the Indian campaigns." Melody examined the saber with interest rather than alarm. "You were a soldier." "Was," Retired in '68 when my enlistment was up and Sarah wanted to settle down. Grant's weathered hands traced the blade's edge. Thought I'd left all this behind when I took up scouting, but seems the past has a way of catching up. Why are you showing me this now? Grant's expression was serious. Because Thomas isn't going to give up, and his hired guns aren't the type to be scared off by harsh words. You need to know what kind of fight you might be facing, and you need to know I can handle my end of it. The practical implications of his words settled over Melody like a cold blanket. You think there'll be violence. I think men like Thomas don't know any other language when they want something bad enough. Grant rewrapped the saber and secured it to his belt. But that doesn't mean we have to wait for them to choose the time and place. Over the next hour, Grant began teaching Melody things no finishing school would have included in its curriculum. He showed her how to load and fire Thomas's rifle skill she picked up with surprising aptitude and how to position herself to make the most of the sod house's defensive advantages. Key thing is to think like they think, he explained as they walked the perimeter of her property. Thomas knows this land, knows the approaches, but he's also lazy and arrogant. He'll come the easy way first, along the main trail. Melody studied the terrain with new eyes, seeing it not as simple prairie, but as a battlefield where positioning and preparation could mean the difference between life and death. How do you know so much about this kind of fighting? Spent 10 years chasing hostiles across territory just like this. Apache, mostly, but some Comanche and Kiowa. Learned to think like they did use the land. Make every advantage count. Never fight fair when you can fight smart. They paused at the creek that ran along the eastern edge of her property, its banks lined with cottonwoods that provided both cover and a natural boundary. Grant knelt to examine the soft earth along the water's edge. Someone's been here recently, he said, pointing to boot prints that were too fresh to have been made before the storm. 2 men, maybe 3. They stayed back in the trees, watching the house. A chill ran down Melody's spine. They're already scouting us. Smart of them. Means they're taking this seriously. Grant stood, brushing dirt from his hands. Also means we need to take it seriously too. They spent the afternoon improving the sod house's defenses. Grant showed Melody how to create firing positions by loosening stones in the walls that could be quickly removed to provide clear shots in multiple directions. They moved supplies, food, water, ammunition to positions where they could be reached safely, even under fire. You've done this before, Melody observed, watching Grant work with practiced efficiency. More times than I care to remember. Apache could keep a garrison pinned down for days if they had good positions and enough patience. He paused in his work to look at her. You having second thoughts about this partnership? Melody considered the question seriously. 3 days ago, her biggest concern had been whether she could manage to light a fire. Now she was learning to shoot rifles and plan defensive strategies. It should have terrified her, but instead she felt an unexpected sense of capability emerging. No, she said finally, I spent most of my life being afraid of being alone, afraid of taking risks, afraid of not being good enough. I'm tired of being afraid. That evening, as they shared a simple dinner of beans and salt pork, Grant told her more about his military service. He spoke matter-of-factly about campaigns and battles, about the harsh realities of frontier warfare, but also about the men he'd served with and the strange camaraderie that developed between soldiers facing death together. What made you leave? Melody asked. Sarah. Grant's expression softened. Met her at a dance in Fort Collins. She was visiting her cousin, teaching school back in Missouri. Prettiest thing I'd ever seen, and smart as a whip. Took me 6 months to convince her to marry a broken-down cavalry sergeant. She came west with you? Eventually. Took another year to talk her into it, and another 2 years to find the right place to settle. She wanted to be near enough to civilization that she could have books and newspapers, but far enough out that we could build something of our own. Melody heard the love and loss in his voice, and felt a pang of something that might have been jealousy. She sounds wonderful. She was. Had a way of seeing the good in everything, even when times were hard. Used to say that every sunset was God's way of reminding us that tomorrow was worth waiting for. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the fire crackling and the wind whistling softly around the corners of the house. Finally, Melody spoke. "I never had that. Someone who loved me enough to build a life around. Neither did I, until Sarah. Was 38 when I met her. Figured I was too set in my ways for marriage." Grant met her eyes across the table. "Point is, it's never too late to start over, if you find the right person to start over with." The next morning brought a visitor, not Thomas or his gunman, but a weathered man in his 50s riding a paint horse and leading a pack mule. Grant watched his approach with interest rather than alarm. "That's Jake Morrison," he told Melody. "Runs cattle for the Triple B Ranch. Good man." Jake dismounted with the careful movements of someone whose joints had taken a beating over the years. "Grant Holloway," he said by way of greeting. "Heard you were in these parts." "Jake," Grant clasped the man's hand warmly. "What brings you by?" "Word's getting around that you and the lady here are having some trouble with Tom Whitmore." Jake touched his hat brim politely to Melody. "Ma'am, Jake Morrison." "Melody Crane. Would you like coffee?" "Appreciate it." Jake followed them into the house, his sharp eyes taking in the defensive preparations without comment. "Grant, I'll speak plain. Tom's been talking in town, claiming this lady owes him money and is refusing to pay. Also says she's not quite right in the head." Melody felt her cheeks burn, but Grant's voice was calm. "What else is he saying?" "That he's got legal papers giving him claim to this land. Says he'll be filing with the territorial court next week." Jake accepted the cup of coffee Melody offered. "Thing is, most folks know Tom Whitmore's a liar and a cheat. Question is, what kind of proof do you have that this is your land, ma'am?" Melody retrieved the deed papers and showed them to Jake, who examined them carefully. "These look genuine," he said finally. "Problem is, Tom's got friends in the territorial government. Money talks loud in those circles." "What would you advise?" Grant asked. Jake was quiet for a moment, sipping his coffee. "Triple B's got some influence too. Boss likes honest folks and hates claim jumpers. Might be willing to provide some legal support if you're interested in fighting this proper." Hope flickered in Melody's chest. What would that involve? Boss would send his lawyer to the territorial capital, file proper papers, make sure your claim gets heard by the right judge. Costs some money, but probably less than Tom's planning to steal from you. Grant and Melody exchanged glances. "What would the Triple B want in return?" Grant asked. "Grazing rights on your creek bottom during dry years. Fair price, all legal and proper. Your land's got the best water for 20 miles in any direction." It was a reasonable offer, perhaps even a generous one, but Melody found herself hesitating, not from distrust, but from the overwhelming sense that her life was changing faster than she could comprehend. "Can we think about it?" she asked. "Course. But don't think too long. Tom's not the patient type, and winter's coming on hard. Gets harder to move, cattle are lawyer sons, the snow gets deep." After Jake left, Melody and Grant walked the boundaries of her property again, this time discussing not just defense but the future. The land was good rich grass, reliable water, protected valleys that would shelter livestock through the worst weather. 1,000 acres, Grant mused. Man could run a decent herd on land like this, build a real ranch, something to last. A man could, Melody agreed. But what about a woman? Grant stopped walking and turned to face her. Woman with the right partner could do anything she set her mind to. Question is, what do you want to set your mind to? Looking across the snow-covered prairie, Melody felt something she hadn't experienced since she was young, the sense that the future was unwritten and full of possibility. "I want to build something that lasts," she said. "Something that's manures. I want to prove that starting over isn't just possible, it's worthwhile." Grant nodded slowly. "Then I reckon we'd better get started." The attack came at dawn on the 4th day, just as Grant had predicted. Melody was awakened not by the sound of gunshots, but by Grant's hand, gently shaking her shoulder. "Stay quiet," he whispered. "We've got company." Through the small window, she could see 3 figures moving through the pre-dawn darkness, approaching the house from different angles. One carried what looked like a torch, while the other two had their weapons drawn. "The pale-eyed one and his friend," Grant murmured, checking the load on his rifle. "Plus someone new. They're planning to burn us out." Melody's heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands were steady as she reached for the revolver Grant had taught her to use. "What do we do?" "You take the east window, I'll take the west. Don't shoot unless you have to, but if you do shoot, make it count." The next few minutes stretched like hours. Melody watched the eastern approach, where one of the men was creeping closer to the house, a can of what she assumed was kerosene in his free hand. Through the thin walls, she could hear Grant's quiet breathing and the soft sounds of him positioning himself for the best shot. The pale-eyed gunman Melody had learned his name was Colt Stevens from Jake Morrison called, out from somewhere near the creek. "Crane, we know you're in there. Come out peaceful and nobody gets hurt." Grant's voice carried clearly through the morning air. "Stevens, you boys are trespassing on private property. Best move along before someone gets hurt." A shot rang out, the bullet thudding into the sod wall near the door. Stevens laughed. "That, the best you can do, old man. Why don't you come out here and face us proper?" Instead of answering, Grant fired a single, precise shot that sent Stevens diving for cover behind a fallen log. The man with the kerosene can panicked and ran, abandoning his plan to fire the house. "Melody," Grant called. "How's your side?" "Clear," she responded, surprised by how calm her voice sounded. The gunfight that followed was brief but intense. Stevens and his companion had counted on intimidation and surprise, not on facing someone with Grant's military experience. Within 10 minutes, one man was wounded and retreating toward their horses, while Stevens himself was pinned down and running low on ammunition. "This ain't over," Stevens shouted as he made his own retreat. "Tom's got legal papers. You can fight us, but you can't fight the law." "We'll see about that," Grant called back. As the sound of hoofbeats faded, Melody found herself shaking not from fear, but from the adrenaline of having survived her first gunfight. Grant moved to her side, checking her for injuries with gentle hands. "You did good," he said quietly. "Kept your head, followed orders. Sarah would have been proud." The comparison to his late wife should have stung, but instead Melody felt honored. "I was terrified," she admitted. "So was I. Difference is, we did what needed doing anyway." Grant's left arm was bleeding from a graze where one of Stevens's bullets had found its mark. Melody insisted on cleaning and bandaging the wound, her domestic skills translating naturally to field medicine. As she worked, she was struck by the intimacy of the moment tending to a man's injury, caring for someone who had risked himself to protect her. "This is going to leave a scar," she said, examining the wound. "Won't be my first." Grant watched her face as she worked. "You're steadier at this than most soldiers I knew." "I've had practice. My sister's children were always getting scraped up." Melody secured the bandage with practiced efficiency. "Though I never expected to be patching up bullet wounds. Life has a way of teaching us things we never thought we'd need to know." Over the next few days, they worked together to strengthen their defenses and prepare for the legal battle ahead. Grant proved to have skills beyond fighting. He could build, repair, and organize with the same methodical precision he brought to everything else. Melody discovered that her own capabilities extended far beyond keeping house. When the roof of the small storage shed began leaking, she found herself climbing up to replace shingles while Grant held the ladder steady. When they needed to move heavy stones to reinforce their defensive positions, she worked alongside him without complaint, her soft hands developing calluses that spoke of honest labor. "You're stronger than you know," Grant observed one evening as they shared dinner by lamplight. "I'm learning that, about a lot of things." Melody looked down at her hands, noting the changes that just a week of hard work had brought. "I spent so many years thinking I was fragile, that I needed someone else to take care of me. Turns out I was wrong." "Weren't wrong about needing someone," Grant said carefully. "Just wrong about what kind of someone you needed." The conversation that followed was the most honest they'd shared yet. Melody found herself telling Grant about her fears not just of Thomas and his threats, but of being alone, of growing old without having made a mark on the world, of dying without having truly lived. Grant listened without judgment, and when she finished, he shared his own fears. The way he'd felt lost after Sarah's death, how he'd taken up scouting partly to avoid the emptiness of their cabin, how he'd begun to believe his best years were behind him. Then I saw you standing there in that wedding dress, fighting to light a fire that might save your life, he said. Reminded me that sometimes the most important battles are the ones we fight just to keep going. That night, for the first time since they'd begun sharing the small house, the boundaries between them began to shift. It started innocently enough. Grant had offered to help Melody mend a tear in her dress, the only other clothing she owned besides the wedding gown, and she had pulled out her sewing kit. The kit was a thing of beauty in its way, each tool precisely placed in its own compartment within a wooden box her father had made for her 16th birthday. Needles of various sizes, thread in colors that spanned the spectrum, tiny scissors sharp enough to cut silk, a thimble worn smooth by years of use. "My grandmother taught me to sew," Melody said, threading a needle with practiced ease. "Said a woman who could mend and make could survive anything." Grant watched her work, fascinated by the precise movements of her hands. She was right. As Melody worked, Grant found himself studying her face in the lamplight. The harsh lines of worry that had marked her features when they first met had begun to soften, replaced by something that looked like contentment. Her hair, which she had taken to braiding back for practical purposes, caught the light in ways that made her look younger than her years. "There," she said, finishing the repair. "Good as new." When she looked up, she found Grant watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. The air between them seemed charged with possibilities neither had yet voiced. "Melody," Grant said quietly. "Yes? I want you to know whatever happens with Thomas, with the land, with any of it, I'm glad the storm brought me to you." The simple words carried more weight than any elaborate declaration. Melody felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the small stove. "I'm glad too," she said. They were sitting close together on the small bench Grant had built, close enough that Melody could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, close enough to notice the way his breath caught slightly when she met his gaze. The kiss, when it came, was as gentle as everything else about Grant Holloway. His lips were warm and soft, and he tasted like coffee and something that was purely him. When they broke apart, Melody felt as if something inside her that had been held tight for years had finally begun to unfurl. "I should apologize," Grant said quietly. "Why?" "Because you're a lady, and I'm a drifter with nothing to offer but trouble and hard times." Melody reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the lines around his eyes. "You're a good man who's offering to build a life with me. That's more than anyone's ever offered before. Even if it means fighting for it. Especially if it means fighting for it." Outside, the wind had picked up again, rattling the windows and reminding them that winter was settling in hard. But inside their small refuge, warmed by more than just the fire, two people who had thought their chances for love had passed them by began to discover that some of life's best gifts come disguised as endings. When they finally sought their separate beds that night, both carried with them the knowledge that something fundamental had changed between them. They were no longer just allies against a common threat, but partners in the truest sense, two people who had chosen to face whatever came next together. And in the morning, when Jake Morrison returned with news about the legal proceedings and an invitation to meet with his boss at the Triple B Ranch, they would face it as a team, bound by more than just circumstance, and strengthened by the growing certainty that some storms, no matter how fierce, only served to reveal what was strong enough to survive them all along. The ride to the Triple B Ranch took most of the morning, following a trail that wound through rolling hills dotted with cattle bearing the distinctive 3-bar brand. Melody rode Thomas's horsey, sturdy bay gelding that had been left behind in his hasty departure, while Grant led the way on his own mount, a grizzled Mustang that seemed to share its owner's quiet competence. As they approached the main ranch buildings, Melody was struck by the scale of the operation. The Triple B was clearly a successful enterprise, with well-maintained corrals, a large barn, and a ranch house that spoke of prosperity built through years of hard work and smart management. Charles Brennan, the ranch owner, proved to be a man in his early 60s with silver hair and the kind of presence that commanded respect without demanding it. He greeted them on the wide porch of his home, his handshake firm and his manner welcoming. "Miss Crane, Mr. Holloway, Jake's told me about your situation." Brennan gestured for them to sit in the comfortable chairs arranged on the porch. "I've taken the liberty of having my lawyer look into the matter." Melody felt her stomach tighten. What did he discover? "Several interesting things. First, your father's original claim is solid, properly filed, legally proved up, and clearly documented. Second, Thomas Whitmore never had any legal claim to your property, though he's been telling people otherwise for months." Grant leaned forward. "What about his bill of sale?" "Forgery, and not a very good one. The signature, purporting to be Miss Crane's, doesn't match the one on her father's will, which we located in the territorial records." Brennan's expression grew grim. "Unfortunately, that's not the end of the story." Melody's heart sank. "What else?" "Whitmore's been busy. He's filed a claim with the territorial court, alleging that you're mentally incompetent and unable to manage property. He's also claimed that you owe him substantial debts that can only be repaid through transfer of your land." "That's preposterous," Melody said, her voice rising. "I've never borrowed a penny from that man. We know that, and we can prove it. But proving it will take time, and Whitmore's got friends in the territorial government who might be willing to expedite his claims." Brennan paused, studying their faces. "There's something else. Jake mentioned you might have other enemies." Grant described the attack by Stevens and his men, and Brennan's expression grew increasingly serious. "Colt Stevens works for whoever pays him, but he's not cheap. Someone's investing serious money in getting your land." "Any idea who?" Grant asked. "Few possibilities. There's been talk about a railroad spur coming through this territory. If that's true, your property, especially with its water rights, would be worth 10 times what it is now." The implications hit Melody like a physical blow. So this was never about Thomas wanting revenge for being spurned. It was always about the money. "Looks that way. Question is, what do you want to do about it?" Brennan's lawyer, a thin man named Patterson, who had arrived during their conversation, spread out several documents on a small table. "We can fight this through legal channels, but it'll be expensive and time-consuming. Alternatively, you could sell the land to Mr. Brennan here for a fair price and avoid the whole mess." Melody looked at Grant, seeing her own thoughts reflected in his eyes. Selling would be the smart thing to do. Take the money and start over somewhere else, away from the threats and complications. "What would you consider a fair price?" she asked. Brennan named a figure that made Melody's eyes widen. It was more money than she had ever imagined, possessing enough to buy a comfortable house in town and live modestly for the rest of her life. "That's generous," Grant said quietly. "More than generous." "It's fair value for good land," Brennan replied. "But I want you to understand what you'd be walking away from. That property of yours isn't just valuable because of a potential railroad. It's got some of the best grass and water in the territory. In the right hands, it could support a substantial ranching operation." Melody felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her. A week ago, the choice would have been simple: take the money and run. But now, looking at the life she and Grant had begun to build together, the prospect of starting over somewhere else felt like another kind of defeat. "Could we have some time to think about it?" she asked. "Of course. But don't take too long. Whitmore's pushing for a quick hearing, and my sources tell me he's got the territorial judge's ear." On the ride back to her property, Melody and Grant traveled mostly in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. It wasn't until they stopped to rest the horses at a creek crossing that Melody finally spoke. "What would you do if you were me?" Grant dismounted and loosened his horse's girth, giving the animal a chance to drink. "Depends on what matters most to you, security or independence." "I've spent my whole life choosing security. Look where it got me." "Different kind of security now, though. Brennan's offer would set you up for life. No more worrying about money, no more fighting men like Stevens. Melody studied his profile, noting the careful neutrality in his voice. But nothing. It's your land, your choice. I'll stand by whatever you decide. That's not what I asked. I asked what you would do. Grant was quiet for a long moment, watching the water flow over the smooth stones of the creek bed. I'd fight, he said finally. Not because it's smart or safe, but because some things are worth fighting for. That land, it's not just property, it's home. It's the chance to build something that lasts. Even if we lose everything, even then, because at least we'd know we tried. That evening, as they sat by the fire in their small house, Melody pulled out her father's Bible and opened it to the pages where she'd found the land deed. Tucked between the pages were other documents, letters her father had written but never sent, pressed flowers from the prairie he'd never seen, sketches of the house he'd planned to build. "Look at this," she said, showing Grant a detailed drawing of a ranch house with a wide porch and dormer windows. "He drew this before he died. He was planning to bring us all out here once he got established." Grant studied the drawing, noting the careful attention to detail, the way the house was positioned to take advantage of both the view and the prevailing winds. He knew what he was doing. This is good design for this country. He never got the chance to build it, died of pneumonia that winter, and Mother burned most of his papers, said they were foolish dreams that only brought heartache. "What do you think?" Melody traced her finger along the lines of her father's drawing. "I think maybe the only real heartache comes from not pursuing your dreams when you get the chance." The next morning brought another visitor, not Jake Morrison this time, but a woman in her 40s, riding side saddle on a well-groomed mare. She dismounted with practiced grace and approached the house with the confidence of someone accustomed to being welcomed. "Miss Crane, I'm Helen Brennan, Charles's daughter. I hope you don't mind my calling uninvited." Melody invited her in for coffee, curious about this unexpected visit. Helen Brennan was an attractive woman with intelligent eyes and the kind of direct manner that suggested she didn't waste time on social pleasantries. "I wanted to talk to you about something my father didn't mention yesterday," Helen said after accepting a cup of coffee, "the women's side of frontier life." "I'm not sure I understand." Helen smiled. "Men like my father and Mr. Holloway, there they think about land in terms of cattle and grass and water rights. But women see it differently. We see it in terms of community, schools, churches, the things that make a place into a home." Grant excused himself to tend to the horses, clearly recognizing that this was a conversation better held between women. Once he was gone, Helen's manner became even more direct. "You're thinking about selling to my father. We're considering it." "Don't." The blunt statement caught Melody off guard. "Why not?" "Because women like you are exactly what this territory needs. You're educated, capable, and you're not afraid of hard work. If you sell out to my father, you'll just be another woman living on someone else's charity. But if you stay and fight, you could be something more." Helen leaned forward, her eyes bright with passion. "Miss Crane, there are maybe a dozen women in this whole territory who own property in their own right. Most of them inherited it from husbands or fathers and sold it as quickly as they could. You have the chance to be different. I appreciate what you're saying, but the practical problems can be solved. I've been talking to some of the other women in the territory. We've been discussing the possibility of forming an association, women property owners, helping each other with legal issues, sharing resources, providing mutual support." The idea was intriguing, but Melody could see the obstacles. What about men like Thomas? The threats, the violence? That's where men like Mr. Holloway come in. You've got protection, and you've got legal backing if you want it. More importantly, you've got something most women out here don't have: a real partnership with a man who respects your independence. Helen's words stayed with Melody long after she left. That evening, as she and Grant worked together to prepare dinner, she found herself studying their easy partnership with new eyes. He never presumed to make decisions for her, never treated her opinions as less important than his own, never made her feel like she was anything less than an equal partner in their enterprise. Helen Brennan had some interesting things to say. she told him as they ate. Grant listened, without interrupting, as Melody recounted the conversation, including Helen's ideas about the Women's Association and her arguments for staying and fighting. "What do you think?" Melody asked when she finished. "I think Helen Brennan's a smart woman who sees the bigger picture. Question is, are you ready to be a pioneer in more ways than one?" Melody looked around their small house, seeing it not as a temporary shelter, but as the beginning of something larger. "My father drew plans for a house," she said slowly, "but he never got to build it. Maybe it's time someone did." Grant's smile was warm and proud. "Then I reckon we'd better start figuring out how to make that happen." Outside, the wind carried the promise of more snow, but inside their small refuge, two people who had found each other against all odds began to plan for a future that would be entirely their own making. The silver locket was warm from Grant's pocket when he placed it in Melody's hands 3 weeks later. They were standing on the small rise behind the sod house, watching the sun set over the snow-covered prairie, when he pulled the delicate piece of jewelry from his coat. "This belonged to Sarah," he said quietly. "Thought you should have it." Melody opened the locket carefully, revealing a tiny photograph of a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. The resemblance to Grant was subtle but unmistakable. They had both possessed the same quality of quiet strength. "She's beautiful," Melody said softly. "But Grant, I can't take this. It's too precious." "She'd want you to have it. Sarah always said that love was meant to be shared, not hoarded." Grant's weathered hands covered Melody's as she held the locket. "Besides, I've been carrying her memory in my heart for 3 years. Time I made room for someone else there." The words were simple, but their meaning was profound. Melody felt tears sting her eyes as she looked up at him. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" "I'm saying that I love you, Melody Crane. Love your courage, your kindness, your stubborn refusal to give up when things get hard. I'm saying that if you'll have me, I'd like to spend whatever years I've got left building something with you." The kiss that followed was different from their first, deeper, more certain, carrying with it the weight of commitment and the promise of shared tomorrows. When they broke apart, Melody was wearing the locket, its silver chain cool against her throat. "I love you too," she whispered, "more than I thought I was capable of loving anyone." Their newfound certainty about each other came at a crucial time, because the pressure from outside forces was mounting daily. Thomas had apparently decided that legal maneuvering was taking too long. The harassment escalated from mere threats to actual sabotage offenses cut, water troughs fouled, supplies stolen from their small shed. Worse, word had reached them through Jake Morrison that Thomas was spreading rumors in town about Melody's mental state and Grant's questionable past. The stories were vicious and designed to isolate them from potential allies in the community. "Heard tell he's claiming you're living in sin," Jake reported during one of his visits. "Says Grant here is taking advantage of a poor, addled woman who doesn't know her own mind." Melody felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger. "And people believe this?" "Some do. Others are smart enough to judge for themselves. But it's causing talk, and talk has a way of becoming truth if it goes on long enough." The social isolation was harder on Melody than the physical threats. She had hoped to build relationships with other women in the territory, to create the kind of community Helen Brennan had described. Instead, she found herself increasingly cut off from any social contact beyond Grant and their few loyal allies. The breaking point came when they rode into town for supplies and were turned away from the general store by a merchant who claimed he couldn't extend credit to people of questionable character. The humiliation burned, but it was Grant's reaction that surprised her. Instead of anger, he seemed almost relieved. "Been wondering when they'd show their true colors," he said, as they loaded their supplies at the smaller store on the edge of Toner Place, run by a German immigrant who cared more about cash than gossip. "Doesn't it bother you, what they're saying about us?" "Only bothers me if it bothers you. My opinion of myself isn't based on what small-minded people think." Grant secured their purchases in the wagon bed. "Question is, are you strong enough to weather this kind of storm?" Melody considered the question seriously. A month ago, the disapproval of an entire town would have sent her fleeing. Now, strengthened by love and partnership and the growing sense of her own capabilities, she found she cared less about their opinions than she had expected. "Let them talk," she said finally. "We know the truth." That evening, as they worked together to repair a section of fence that had been vandalized, Grant broached a subject that had been weighing on both their minds. "Been thinking we should make this official," he said, setting a fence post with practiced efficiency. "Make what official?" "Us. Our partnership. Think it's time we got married." Melody paused in her work, hammer in hand. "Is that a proposal, Mr. Holloway?" Grant straightened, suddenly looking uncertain. "Suppose it is. Not much of one, though. No ring, no fancy words, no getting down on one knee." "Grant Holloway," Melody said, setting down her hammer and facing him fully. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "Yes, ma'am, I am." "Then yes, I'll marry you. Not because it will stop the gossip or make things easier, but because I want to spend my life with you." Grant's relief was visible. "When?" "Soon as we can arrange it. No point in waiting." The practical arrangements proved more complicated than either had anticipated. The territorial law required either a justice of the peace or a minister to perform the ceremony, and the nearest official was in Rapid City, 3 days' hard ride away. Moreover, Thomas's legal machinations had created complications. There were questions about Melody's legal status that might affect her ability to enter into marriage contracts. The solution came from an unexpected source. Pastor Wilhelm Zimmer, the German minister who served several small communities in the territory, arrived at their door on a snowy evening in early December. He was a small man with wire-rimmed spectacles and a gentle manner that immediately put them at ease. "I heard you might be in need of a minister," he said in accented but clear English. "Also heard you might be facing troubles that require more than just spiritual guidance." Over dinner, Pastor Zimmer proved to be a man of both faith and practical wisdom. He listened to their story without judgment and offered solutions that went beyond the merely religious. "In my country, I was trained in law as well as theology," he explained. "Here, I serve communities that are too small and too poor for separate lawyers and ministers. I can perform your marriage ceremony in a way that will be legally unassailable, regardless of any claims Mr. Whitmore might make." Better yet, Pastor Zimmer brought news from the territorial capital. "The territorial judge who was supposed to hear Whitmore's case has been replaced. The new man has a reputation for honesty and fairness. Your case will get a proper hearing." The wedding ceremony took place 3 days later in their small sod house, with Jake Morrison and his wife as witnesses. Melody wore her traveling dress, the only respectable outfit she owned, besides the wedding gown that held too many painful memories. Grant had polished his cavalry saber and wore it at his side, a symbol of his commitment to protect what was theirs. Pastor Zimmer's words were simple but profound, speaking of partnership and commitment, of the courage required to build a life together in a harsh land, of the faith needed to believe in tomorrow, when today held so many challenges. When Grant slipped a simple gold band onto Melody's finger, his own wedding ring, resized by the town's blacksmith, she felt something settle into place inside her. She was no longer Melody Crane, the spinster who had waited too long for love. She was Melody Holloway, a woman who had chosen her own destiny and found a partner worthy of sharing it. The kiss that sealed their marriage was witnessed by the crackling fire, the gentle snowfall outside their window, and the growing certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. That night, as Mrs. Melody Holloway lay in her husband's arms, she reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 weeks ago, she had been a woman abandoned in a wedding dress, struggling to light a fire that might save her life. Now she was a married woman with legal claim to 1,000 acres of prime land and a partner who valued her strength as much as her affection. Outside, the wind howled across the prairie, and somewhere in the darkness, men who wished them ill might be planning new threats. But inside their small house, 2 people who had found love later in life than they had expected discovered that some fires, once properly kindled, burned bright enough to warm even the coldest night. The telegraph message arrived on a bitter January morning, carried by a rider who had pushed his horse hard through the snow to reach them. Grant's face went pale as he read the yellow paper, his hands trembling slightly as he set it down on their kitchen table. "What is it?" Melody asked, alarmed by his reaction. Grant was quiet for a long moment, staring at the message as if hoping the words might change. Finally, he looked up at her with eyes full of pain and something that might have been fear. "It's from Fort Collins. There's a military tribunal being convened. They want me to report for questioning regarding events that took place during my last posting." Melody felt cold dread settle in her stomach. What kind of events? The kind that can get a man hanged, even 20 years later. Grant stood and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered prairie as if seeing something else entirely. When he began to speak, his voice carried the weight of years and secrets he had hoped never to share. "Spring of 1867, we were chasing a band of Cheyenne raiders who had hit a wagon train near the Platte River, caught up with them at a place called Beaver Creek. Should have been a straightforward engagement. We had superior numbers and position." He paused, his hands clenched behind his back. "But when we got there, we found they had hostages, 3 women and 2 children from the wagon train. The commanding officer, a green lieutenant fresh from West Point, ordered an immediate attack, said we couldn't let savages dictate terms." Melody felt her heart sink as she began to understand where this story was leading. "I tried to argue for negotiations, for patience. The Cheyenne weren't going anywhere, we had them cornered. But the lieutenant wouldn't listen. Said I was showing cowardice in the face of the enemy." Grant turned from the window, his face etched with old pain. "So I did something that's haunted me every day since. I disobeyed a direct order. When he gave the command to attack, I countermanded it, told the men to hold position. What happened? The lieutenant tried to have me arrested on the spot. I had to draw my saber on him to prevent it. For a few minutes there, it looked like we might have a fight between soldiers instead of with the Cheyenne." Grant's voice grew quieter. "But the delay worked. The Cheyenne chief saw what was happening, saw that we were divided. He took the chance to negotiate, release the hostages in exchange for safe passage to their winter camp." Melody felt confused. "But that sounds like the right thing to do. You saved those people's lives." "Maybe. But I also committed mutiny against a commissioned officer. In military law, that's a hanging offense, regardless of the outcome." The full implications began to sink in. "Someone reported you." "Lieutenant Morisano, relation to Jake, filed charges the moment we returned to the fort. But before they could convene a court-martial, I was transferred to another posting, then another. Spent the next year being shuffled around the frontier until my enlistment was up." Grant returned to the table, picking up the telegraph message. "Always figured they'd lost the paperwork, or decided it wasn't worth pursuing after the fact. Apparently, I was wrong." Melody read the telegram herself, noting the official seal and the formal language that demanded Grant's immediate surrender to military authorities. Why now, after all these years? Good question. Could be they're cleaning up old business. Could be someone wants me out of the way. Grant's expression grew grim. Or could be Lieutenant Morrison finally got enough rank to pursue his grudge. The timing of the summons was suspicious, arriving just as their legal battle with Thomas was reaching a critical stage. Melody voiced the concern they were both thinking. "This can't be a coincidence." "Probably not. Thomas has been busy making friends in high places. Wouldn't surprise me if one of them had connections to the military." Over the next few hours, as they discussed their options, the full scope of their dilemma became clear. If Grant surrendered to the military authorities, he would almost certainly face court-martial and possible execution. If he refused to surrender, he would become a fugitive, making their legal troubles with Thomas irrelevant. You couldn't own property if you were married to an outlaw. "There's a third option," Grant said quietly. "I could leave, disappear. You could claim you didn't know about my past, get the marriage annulled." "Absolutely not. Melody, be practical. You could still fight Thomas's claims, maybe even win. But if you're tied to a deserter, you're not a deserter. You served honorably for 22 years. Melody's voice was fierce. "And I'm not abandoning my husband the first time things get difficult." That afternoon, Jake Morrison arrived with more disturbing news. Word of the military summons had somehow reached town ahead of the official messenger, and Thomas was already spreading the story that Grant was a wanted criminal who had deceived them all. "Worse than that," Jake reported. "He's claiming that Grant married you under false pretenses, which means the marriage isn't legal. Says he's going to petition the territorial court to have it annulled and place you under his protection as your nearest male relative." The legal web was tightening around them with frightening speed. It was clear that someone with considerable influence was orchestrating events to ensure that Grant was removed from the picture and Melody's property fell into the right hands. That evening, as they sat by the fire trying to plan their next move, another unexpected visitor arrived. This time it was Pastor Zimmer, but he was not alone. With him was a tall man in a military uniform who introduced himself as Colonel Robert Hayes, commanding officer of Fort Collins. "Mr. Holloway," the colonel said without preamble, "we need to talk." Grant stood slowly, his hand instinctively moving toward where his saber would normally hang. "Colonel, relax, Sergeant. I'm not here to arrest you. I'm here because there are some things about that telegram you need to know." Colonel Hayes accepted the coffee Melody offered and settled into one of their chairs with the air of a man who had ridden hard to get there. "First thing you should know is that Lieutenant Morrison never made it past captain. Died of cholera in '69 at Fort Laramie." Grant's confusion was evident. "Then who filed the charges?" "That's where it gets interesting. The paperwork was filed last month, nearly 20 years after the fact, by someone claiming to represent Morrison's estate. But when we investigated, we found that Morrison died without family and left no estate." The colonel leaned forward, his expression grave. "Someone's using military channels to pursue a civilian agenda. Someone with enough influence to access old military records and enough money to bribe the right clerks." Melody felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. "Thomas, or whoever's backing him." "Most likely. But here's the thing, they made a mistake. Military law requires that charges be filed within a reasonable time of the alleged offense. 20 years is way beyond any reasonable statute of limitations." Grant's relief was visible, but Colonel Hayes held up a warning hand. "However, the charges have been filed, and they'll have to be addressed. You can either surrender voluntarily for a hearing that will almost certainly result in dismissal, or you can wait for them to send marshals after you." "What would you recommend?" Grant asked. "Surrender voluntarily, but do it smart. Bring a civilian lawyer, make sure the hearing is public, and have witnesses ready to testify to your character." The colonel paused. "I'll be testifying myself, if it comes to that. What you did at Beaver Creek was the right thing, regardless of what military law says about it." Pastor Zimmer, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke. "There's something else you should know. I've been in contact with some of my colleagues in other territories. This pattern using military or legal technicalities to force property transfers happened before. Always involves prime land with valuable resources." The scope of the conspiracy was becoming clearer, but so was the path forward. Grant would have to face the military tribunal, but with the right preparation and support, there was a good chance the charges would be dismissed. More importantly, they now understood that their enemies were not invincible. They could make mistakes, and those mistakes could be exploited. As their visitors prepared to leave, Colonel Hayes pulled Grant aside for a private word. "Sergeant, there's one more thing. The official record of the Beaver Creek incident includes testimony from the hostages you saved. All 5 of them testified that your actions saved their lives. That testimony is part of the permanent record." After the colonel and pastor left, Grant and Melody sat in their small house, holding each other close and trying to process everything they had learned. The danger was far from over, but for the first time in weeks, they felt like they had a chance to fight back. "So we go to Fort Collins," Melody said, "together. It'll be dangerous. If this goes badly, then we'll face it together. That's what marriage means, isn't it? For better or worse, in sickness and in health and in military tribunals." Grant's smile was the first genuine one she'd seen from him all day. "When you put it that way, how can I argue?" Outside, the wind continued to howl across the prairie, but inside their small house, two people who had thought their past was behind them prepared to confront the demons that threatened their future. They had learned that love was not always enough to overcome the obstacles life placed in your path, but it was enough to give you the courage to try. The journey to Fort Collins took 5 days through winter weather that seemed determined to test their resolve. Grant and Melody traveled with a small party that included Colonel Hayes, Pastor Zimmer, and Charles Brennan, who had insisted on providing both legal support and moral authority to their cause. On the third night, camped in a sheltered valley with the wind howling overhead, Grant made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He pulled his wedding ring from his finger, the simple gold band he had worn for nearly 30 years, and held it out to Melody. "I want you to have this," he said quietly. Melody looked at the ring in confusion. "Grant, I already have a ring. Not like this one. This was my grandfather's, and his grandfather's before that. Been in the Holloway family for over 100 years. Grant's weathered hands trembled slightly as he spoke. "My father gave it to me when I enlisted, said it would bring me home safe from whatever wars I faced. Then you should keep wearing it." Grant shook his head, his expression serious in the firelight. "I've fought my last war, Melody. Time to pass it on to someone who's just beginning theirs." The weight of his words settled over the small group. They all understood that the hearing at Fort Collins was more than just a military proceeding. It was a battle for their future, and the outcome would determine whether they could build the life they had dreamed of. "Besides," Grant continued, his voice growing stronger, "I want to ask you something, and I want to do it proper this time." To everyone's surprise, Grant Holloway, veteran of countless battles, survivor of 2 decades on the frontier, dropped to one knee in the snow beside their campfire. The ring caught the firelight as he held it up to Melody. "Melody Crane Holloway, will you marry me? Not because it's practical or convenient, not because we're thrown together by circumstances, but because I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone. Will you be my wife, my partner, my companion for whatever time we have left in this world?" Tears ran down Melody's cheeks as she looked down at this man who had chosen to make himself vulnerable in front of witnesses, who had offered her not just his protection but his heart and his family's legacy. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, I'll marry you, Grant Holloway, for all the right reasons this time." When he slipped the ancient ring onto her finger, alongside the simpler band he had given her at their first wedding, Melody felt the weight of history and hope combined. This ring had survived wars and wilderness, had been worn by men who had built lives from nothing and passed their dreams on to the next generation. "Now, whatever happens at the hearing," Grant said, rising to take her in his arms, "we face it as true partners." The next 2 days of travel brought them into contact with the wider implications of their struggle. At every settlement they passed, people had heard stories, some true, some wildly distorted, about the couple fighting for their land against powerful interests. Opinion was divided, but increasingly they found sympathy and support from unexpected quarters. In the small town of Cedar Falls, a group of women approached Melody with a proposal that left her speechless. Led by Helen Brennan, who had ridden hard to intercept their party, the women had organized what they called the Territorial Women's Property Rights Association. "We've been talking to other women who own land," Helen explained as they shared a meal at the town's only hotel. "Most of them have faced similar pressuresmen trying to force them to sell, legal challenges to their ownership, social pressure to give up their independence. The association," Helen continued, "had already begun providing mutual support, legal advice, financial assistance, and most importantly, witnesses to testify about the character and competence of women under attack. We'll be sending representatives to your hearing," Helen said, "not just to support you, but to make a statement that women's property rights matter in this territory." The support was gratifying, but it also raised the stakes. Grant and Melody's case was becoming a symbol for larger issues of justice and equality on the frontier. If they lost, It would send a message that powerful interests could manipulate the system with impunity. At Fort Collins, they found that word of their arrival had preceded them. The hearing, originally scheduled to be a routine military proceeding, had attracted attention from territorial officials, newspaper reporters, and curious citizens. What should have been a closed military tribunal was becoming a public spectacle. Colonel Hayes provided them with quarters in the fort's guest facility and arranged for them to meet with the military lawyer who would represent Grant's interests. Captain Thomas Anderson was a serious young man with the kind of legal training that gave Melody hope for a fair hearing. The case against Sergeant Holloway is weak, Anderson explained during their first meeting. Military law is clear about statute of limitations, and the procedural irregularities in filing the charges are numerous. However, the tribunal has the authority to consider the broader implications of military discipline. What does that mean in practical terms? Grant asked. It means they might censure you officially while dismissing the charges, a slap on the wrist to maintain military dignity while acknowledging that justice doesn't require your execution. It was better than they had dared hope, but still left uncertainties. A military censure could affect Grant's pension and might provide ammunition for Thomas's legal challenges to their marriage and property rights. The evening before the hearing, Grant and Melody walked the perimeter of the fort, taking comfort in each other's presence and trying to prepare mentally for whatever the next day might bring. The winter air was crisp and clear, and the stars seemed unusually bright against the dark sky. Regrets? Grant asked, as they paused near the fort's main gate. About what? Any of it. The marriage, the fight, the risks we're taking. Melody considered the question seriously. 6 months ago, her biggest concern had been whether she would spend her remaining years as a maiden aunt in her sister's house. Now she was married to a man facing potential court-martial, fighting for land worth a fortune, and involved in a territorial political struggle that could reshape the rights of women across the frontier. No regrets, she said finally. Whatever happens tomorrow, I'd rather face it as your wife than face a safe, empty life alone. Even if we lose everything, we won't lose everything. We'll still have each other, and that's more than either of us had 6 months ago. Grant stopped walking and pulled her into his arms, holding her close against the cold night air. You know what I love most about you, Melody Holloway? What? You're braver than you know, and stronger than you think, and more precious to me than all the land in the territory. The kiss they shared under the starlit sky was full of promise and commitment, a seal on vows that went deeper than any ceremony could capture. Whatever the tribunal decided, whatever Thomas and his allies tried to do, they would face it together with the kind of love that could survive any storm. As they walked back toward their quarters, Melody fingered the ancient ring on her finger and thought about the generations of Holloway men who had worn it before Grant. All of them had faced challenges, made hard choices, fought for what they believed in. Now it was her turn to carry on that tradition, to prove that the Holloway legacy of courage and determination could pass through marriage as well as blood. Tomorrow would bring the hearing that would determine their fate. Tonight, they held each other close and drew strength from the knowledge that whatever the future held, they would meet it as partners in the fullest sense of the word. In the distance, a bugle played taps, the mournful notes carrying across the fort and out onto the vast prairie beyond. But Grant and Melody heard it not as an ending, but as a promise that dawn would come, bringing with it new chances to fight for the life they had chosen to build together. The military tribunal convened at 8 o'clock sharp in the fort's main assembly hall, a room that had been hastily rearranged to accommodate the unexpectedly large audience. 3 officers sat behind a long table at the front of the room, Colonel William Hartley presiding, with Major Samuel Cross and Captain David Wright flanking him. Grant sat at the defendant's table in his best clothes, the uniform he had worn for his retirement ceremony 20 years earlier, pressed and cleaned, but showing its age. Beside him, Captain Anderson shuffled through papers with the quiet confidence of a man who believed in his case. Melody sat in the front row of spectators, wearing her traveling dress and the ancient Holloway ring that caught the morning light streaming through the tall windows. Around her, she could see faces both familiar and strange: Helen Brennan and several members of the Women's Association, Charles Brennan with his lawyer, Pastor Zimmer, Jake Morrison, and surprisingly, a handful of reporters who had traveled from as far away as Denver to cover the proceedings. "This tribunal is convened," Colonel Hartley announced in a voice that carried authority, "to investigate charges of mutiny and disobedience brought against former Sergeant Grant Holloway, late of the 3rd Cavalry Regiment." The prosecution's case was presented by Major Cross, who read the charges in a formal monotone that drained them of any human context. According to the official record, Sergeant Holloway had refused a direct order from a superior officer, had drawn his weapon against said officer, and had countermanded military orders in the face of the enemy. "These are serious charges," Major Cross intoned, "that strike at the very heart of military discipline. If soldiers are permitted to disobey orders based on their personal judgment, the entire structure of military authority collapses." When Captain Anderson rose to present Grant's defense, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Instead of dwelling on legal technicalities, he began with the testimony of survivors from the Beaver Creek incident. Mary Patterson, now a grandmother living in Colorado Springs, took the witness stand with dignity despite her obvious nervousness. In a clear voice, she described the horror of being captured by Cheyenne raiders, the fear for her children's lives, and the moment when Grant's decision to delay the attack had saved them all. "Sergeant Holloway could have followed orders and attacked immediately," she testified. "If he had, my children and I would have died in the crossfire. Instead, he chose to risk his own career to save our lives." Her testimony was followed by that of Colonel Hayes, who had researched the incident thoroughly. The official record shows that Sergeant Holloway's action resulted in the safe recovery of all hostages without a single military casualty. From a strategic standpoint, it was the correct decision. But it was Grant's own testimony that proved most compelling. When called to speak in his own defense, he stood with the bearing of a soldier, but spoke with the wisdom of a man who had lived with the consequences of his choices for 20 years. "Gentlemen, I don't dispute the facts as presented. I did disobey Lieutenant Morrison's order to attack. I did draw my saber to prevent my own arrest. I did countermand his order and negotiate with the enemy." A murmur ran through the audience at this frank admission, but Grant continued steadily. "What I dispute is the suggestion that military discipline requires blind obedience to orders that will result in unnecessary death. The lives of 5 innocent people hung in the balance that day. I had seconds to decide between following procedure and doing what I knew was right." Grant paused, his eyes moving across the faces of the tribunal members. "I've served this army for 22 years. I've followed orders that sent me into battles where good men died. I've never once questioned the chain of command or my duty as a soldier. But when faced with a choice between military protocol and human decency, I chose decency. I'd make the same choice again." The silence that followed his words was profound. Then Colonel Hartley asked the question that went to the heart of the matter. "Sergeant Holloway, do you believe soldiers have the right to disobey orders they consider morally wrong?" Grant considered his answer carefully. "No, sir. I believe soldiers have the obligation to follow lawful orders from competent officers. But when an order will result in the unnecessary death of innocent civilians, when that order comes from an inexperienced officer who refuses to consider alternatives, then yes, I believe a senior non-commissioned officer has a duty to act on his judgment and experience." It was then that Captain Anderson produced the evidence that would prove decisive Grant's Medal of Honor, earned for actions during the Battle of Little Bighorn, hidden away in Grant's personal effects for 20 years. "This medal," Anderson said, holding it up for the tribunal to see, "was awarded to then Sergeant Holloway for extraordinary gallantry and risk of life in action against hostile forces." The citation specifically mentions his initiative in reorganizing scattered cavalry units and leading a counterattack that saved an entire company from annihilation. Anderson read from the official citation, Sergeant Holloway's quick thinking and courageous leadership in the absence of commissioned officers exemplifies the highest traditions of military service. The irony was not lost on anyone in the room. The same qualities that had earned Grant the nation's highest military decoration initiative, moral courage, willingness to take responsibility in crisis situations, were now being presented as grounds for court-martial. Colonel Hartley called for a brief recess, and the three officers retired to consider their decision. In the hallway outside the assembly room, Melody found herself surrounded by supporters who had traveled far to witness the proceedings. Regardless of what they decide, Helen Brennan said firmly, "You've already won something important. This hearing has shown that ordinary people can stand up to powerful interests and fight for what's right." Pastor Zimmer nodded in agreement. Sometimes the act of resistance is more important than the outcome. You've given others the courage to fight their own battles. When the tribunal reconvened 30 minutes later, the tension in the room was palpable. Colonel Hartley stood to deliver the verdict, his expression grave but not unsympathetic. After careful consideration of all evidence and testimony presented, this tribunal finds that while former Sergeant Holloway's actions at Beaver Creek constituted a technical violation of military discipline, they were taken in good faith to preserve human life and were consistent with the highest traditions of military service. Melody felt her heart stop as she waited for the crucial words that would determine their fate. The charges of mutiny and disobedience are hereby dismissed. Sergeant Holloway's military record will reflect this tribunal's finding that his actions, while irregular, were morally justified and ultimately beneficial to the mission. The room erupted in applause and cheers, but Melody barely heard them. She was watching Grant's face as 20 years of worry and guilt fell away, replaced by something that looked like peace. But their celebration was short-lived. Even as the tribunal was concluding, word arrived that Thomas Whitmore had moved quickly to challenge their marriage in territorial court, claiming that Grant's military hearing proved he was an unstable and unreliable partner for a woman of diminished capacity. The legal battle was far from over, but they had won the first crucial victory. Grant's honor was restored, his military record cleared, and the conspiracy to destroy him through false charges had been exposed and defeated. As they left the assembly hall, hand in hand and surrounded by supporters, Melody felt the weight of the ancient ring on her finger and understood its true significance. It wasn't just a symbol of the Holloway family heritage, it was a reminder that some battles are worth fighting, no matter how long they take or how much they cost. The territorial courthouse in Rapid City was smaller than the military tribunal room, but packed with an even more diverse crowd. Word of Grant's vindication had spread quickly, and the subsequent challenge to their marriage had drawn attention from across the territory and beyond. Thomas Whitmore sat at the plaintiff's table with two lawyers, both expensively dressed men from back east, who clearly considered this frontier courthouse beneath their usual standards. His confidence was evident in every gesture, every whispered consultation with his legal team. Judge Harrison Pierce, newly appointed to the territorial bench, was a man in his 50s with silver hair and the kind of steady demeanor that suggested he had seen enough of life to judge it fairly. His reputation for honesty had preceded him, which was why Thomas's allies had fought so hard to prevent this case from reaching his courtroom. "This court is convened," Judge Pierce announced, "to hear the matter of Whitmore versus Holloway, involving questions of marriage, validity, and property rights." Thomas's lead attorney, a thin man named Pemberton, with the manner of someone accustomed to intimidating frontier judges, rose to present his case with obvious condescension. "Your Honor, my client seeks the annulment of a marriage contracted under false pretenses by a woman of diminished mental capacity with a man of questionable character and criminal background." The words stung, but Melody had steeled herself for such attacks. Beside her, Grant's presence was a steady comfort, his hand warm and reassuring in hers. Pemberton's strategy became clear as he presented his evidence. He called witnesses who claimed to have observed Melody's erratic behavior in the days following her abandonment by Thomas. He produced testimony from townspeople who described her as not quite right in the head and easily manipulated by unscrupulous men. The picture he painted was of a vulnerable woman taken advantage of by a man who had concealed his criminal past and military disgrace. It was a narrative designed to appeal to protective instincts while stripping Melody of any agency in her own life. When Pemberton called Thomas himself to testify, the man's performance was polished and convincing. He portrayed himself as a concerned former fiancé who had tried to help a confused woman, only to be driven away by Grant's threats and violence. "I only wanted to protect her," Thomas said with practiced sincerity. "Melody was always fragile, prone to flights of fancy. When I discovered she had no dowry, I tried to let her down gently, but she became hysterical. I feared for her safety." Charles Brennan's lawyer, a grizzled frontier attorney named Samuel Wright, rose to cross-examine Thomas with the patience of a man who had dealt with liars and cheats for 30 years. "Mr. Whitmore, you claim you were concerned for Miss Crane's welfare, yet you left her alone in a blizzard with no supplies and no means of making fire." Two was upset. "I wasn't thinking clearly. And these legal papers you filed claiming ownership of her property, they were also filed out of concern for her welfare." Thomas's composure began to crack. "She needs a man to manage such valuable property. A woman alone can't." "Can't what, Mr. Whitmore? Can't own property, can't make decisions, can't choose her own husband." The cross-examination continued for an hour, with Wright systematically dismantling Thomas's credibility and exposing the financial motivations behind his actions. By the time it was finished, Thomas was sweating despite the winter cold. But it was the defense's presentation that truly turned the tide. Instead of simply refuting the attacks on Melody's competence, Wright and Captain Anderson, who had agreed to assist with the civilian case, built a positive picture of a woman who had not only survived abandonment and threats, but had thrived under pressure. Helen Brennan testified about the Women's Property Rights Association and Melody's role in inspiring other women to assert their legal rights. Pastor Zimmer spoke about the couple's strong marriage and their positive impact on the community. Jake Morrison described Melody's courage under fire and her practical competence in managing her property. Most powerful of all was Colonel Hayes, who had traveled from Fort Collins specifically to testify about Grant's character and service record. "In 30 years of military service," the colonel said, "I have rarely encountered a man of greater integrity or moral courage than Grant Holloway. His actions at Beaver Creek saved 5 innocent lives. His service record is exemplary. Any woman would be fortunate to have such a man as her partner." When Melody herself took the witness stand, the courtroom fell silent. She had dressed carefully in her best traveling dress, her hair arranged simply but elegantly, the ancient Holloway ring visible on her finger alongside her wedding band. "Mrs. Holloway," Wright began gently, "please tell the court about your decision to marry Grant Holloway." Melody's voice was clear and steady as she spoke. "I married Grant because I love him and because he respects me as an equal partner. He has never tried to control me or manage my affairs without my consent. He has protected me from those who would harm me, but he has also encouraged me to be strong and independent." She paused, looking directly at Thomas. "Mr. Whitmore left me because I had no money to bring to our marriage. Grant married me knowing I owned valuable property, but he has never once suggested that he should control it or that I'm incapable of managing it myself. And how do you feel about the claims that you lack the mental capacity to make such important decisions?" Melody's smile was sad but determined. "Your Honor, I have managed households, raised children, survived abandonment and threats, defended my property against armed men, and built a successful partnership with my husband. If that's the behavior of a woman with diminished capacity, then I would suggest the problem lies not with my mind, but with the expectations of those who would prefer women to be helpless." The courtroom erupted in applause, and Judge Pierce had to use his gavel to restore order. When the testimony concluded and the attorneys made their final arguments, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Judge Pierce retired to consider his decision, but returned within 30 minutes, a sign that the choice had been clear. After reviewing all evidence and testimony, he began, "This court finds no basis for the claims made against Mrs. Holloway's mental competence or her husband's character. The marriage between Grant and Melody Holloway is valid and legally binding." The judge's next words sent a murmur through the crowd. "Furthermore, this court finds that Mr. Whitmore's claims were filed in bad faith, apparently motivated by financial gain rather than genuine concern. His petition for guardianship is denied, and he is hereby ordered to cease all harassment of the defendants." But Judge Pierce wasn't finished. "This case raises important questions about women's property rights in our territory. Let me be clear. A woman's decision to marry, to own property, and to manage her own affairs cannot be overturned simply because some men find those decisions inconvenient." As the gavel fell, Melody felt 20 years of self-doubt and fear fall away. She was officially, legally, and completely Mrs. Grant Holloway, with all the rights and responsibilities that entailed. The marriage certificate that Pastor Zimmer presented to them after the hearing was more than just a legal document. It was a declaration of independence, a statement that love and partnership could triumph over greed and manipulation. Outside the courthouse, in the crisp February air, Grant and Melody stood surrounded by friends and supporters who had traveled hundreds of miles to witness their victory. The ancient ring on Melody's finger caught the sunlight, and she realized that she was now part of a tradition that valued courage, integrity, and the willingness to fight for what was right. "So what now?" Grant asked, holding her close. "Now we go home," Melody said, looking toward the prairie that stretched endlessly in all directions. "And we build the life we dreamed of." The legal battles were over, their enemies defeated, and their future secured. But more than that, they had proven to themselves and to everyone, watching, that love could indeed conquer all, not through magic or wishful thinking, but through the hard work of two people committed to building something lasting together. Spring arrived early on the Dakota prairie that year, bringing with it the kind of warmth and renewal that seemed to promise better times ahead. The snow melted in rushing streams that fed Willow Creek, and the first green shoots of prairie grass pushed through the dark earth like hope made visible. Melody stood on the porch of their new house built, according to her father's carefully preserved plans, and watched Grant work with a crew of men to repair the last section of fence damaged during the winter's troubles. The house itself was a testament to their partnership. Grant's practical knowledge of construction combined with Melody's eye for detail and comfort. It was larger than the original sod house, but not ostentatious, with wide windows that let in the prairie light, and a kitchen designed for both everyday meals and the entertaining that came with their growing prominence in the territory. The dormer windows her father had sketched so carefully now looked out over land that stretched to the horizon, land that was unquestionably and legally theirs. "Mrs. Holloway?" Helen Brennan's voice carried across the yard as she approached on horseback, followed by 3 other women Melody had come to know through the Property Rights Association. "Helen," Melody called back, wiping her hands on her apron as she came down from the porch. "What brings you all out this way?" "Good news," Helen said, dismounting with the easy grace of a woman who had spent her life on horseback. "The territorial legislature has passed the Married Women's Property Act. Women can now own and control property independently of their husbands, and no man can be appointed guardian of a competent adult woman without clear evidence of mental incapacity." The implications took a moment to sink in. "You mean what happened to me, what Thomas tried to do it, can't happen to other women now?" "Not easily, and not without a real legal fight." Helen's smile was triumphant. "Your case became the catalyst. When Judge Pierce's decision was reported in newspapers across the territory, it sparked a movement. Women from every county started writing to their representatives, demanding legal protection. Margaret Walsh, the schoolteacher from Cedar Falls, spoke up. "They're calling it the Holloway Act in some of the papers. Your fight made this possible." Melody felt tears sting her eyes. When she had decided to fight for her land and her marriage, she had been thinking only of her own future with Grant. The idea that their struggle might help other women had never occurred to her. "There's more," Helen continued. "The association has been asked to testify before Congress about women's property rights in the territories. They want to use our work here as a model for federal legislation." That evening, as Melody and Grant sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the prairie sky in shades of gold and crimson, she told him about the day's news. Grant listened with the quiet pride she had come to love, never taking credit for himself, but clearly delighted by her growing recognition and influence. "Seems fitting," he said when she finished. "You've always been stronger than you knew. Now other people are starting to figure that out too." As if summoned by their conversation, Jake Morrison appeared on the trail leading to their house, but this time he wasn't alone. A buggy followed him, carrying Pastor Zimmer and a young woman with a baby in her arms. "Evening, folks," Jake called as they approached. "Got someone here who wanted to meet you." The young woman introduced herself as Sarah Fletcher, a widow from a settlement 50 miles north. Her story was familiar in its broad outlines. Husband killed in a farming accident, pressure from male relatives to give up her homestead claim, threats and intimidation designed to force her off valuable land. "I heard about what you did," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "How you fought them, and won. I was wondering, hoping that maybe you could tell me how." Over the next hour, as they shared coffee and cake on the porch, while Sarah's baby slept peacefully in Melody's arms, the conversation turned into something like a strategy session. Grant and Melody shared what they had learned about legal procedures, community organizing, and the importance of finding allies in unexpected places. "The key thing," Melody said, gently rocking the sleeping infant, "is to remember that you're not alone. There are more people who believe in justice than there are who profit from injustice. You just have to find them and give them a reason to act." Pastor Zimmer nodded in agreement. "I've been traveling more widely since your case concluded. Every settlement I visit, I find women facing similar problems. The network Helen Brennan started is growing faster than anyone anticipated." When their visitors finally departed, carrying with them practical advice and the promise of ongoing support, Melody and Grant remained on the porch as darkness settled over the prairie. The night was warm enough to sit outside comfortably, and the stars seemed unusually bright in the clear air. "Do you remember," Melody asked, "that first night when we sheltered together from the blizzard, when you said some fires burned bright enough to warm even the coldest night?" "I remember. I was thinking about my wedding dress, the one I was wearing when you found me." Melody smiled at the memory. "I hated that dress for so long. It represented everything that had gone wrong, every hope that had been crushed." "What changed your mind?" "Mrs. Patterson, Mary Patterson, who testified at your hearing, she's expecting her first grandchild. She asked if I had any baby clothes to spare." Melody leaned against Grant's shoulder, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "So I took that wedding dress apart, piece by piece, and made it into a christening gown. All that silk and lace, all that careful stitch-and-jits, going to welcome a new life instead of mourning an old disappointment." Grant's arm tightened around her. "Seems like a fitting end to the story." "Not an end," Melody corrected. "A beginning. That baby will wear something made from the dress I wore when I met you. In a way, our story will be part of theirs." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the prairieth distant howl of coyotes, the whisper of wind through the grass, the soft lowing of cattle in the far pastures. It was the sound of home, of a life built through struggle and sustained by love. "Any regrets?" Grant asked, echoing the question he had posed so many months ago. "Only one," Melody said. "I regret that it took me 54 years to find the courage to fight for what I wanted. But then again, maybe I needed to be 54 to have the wisdom to recognize what was worth fighting for." "And what was worth fighting for?" Melody turned to look at her husband, this weathered gentleman who had taught her that strength and kindness could coexist, that love was not about possession but about partnership, that some storms only revealed what was strong enough to survive them. "This," she said simply, "us, the right to choose our own path and build our own future. the chance to help other people do the same. As they finally rose to go inside, Melody caught sight of her reflection in the window glass, a woman approaching 55, her hair showing silver threads, her hands bearing the calluses of honest work, her face marked by sun and wind and the kind of contentment that came from a life fully lived. She looked nothing like the frightened woman in the wedding dress who had struggled to light a fire on a cold November evening. That woman had been waiting for someone else to rescue her, to give her life meaning and purpose. This woman had learned to rescue herself and had found that the best kind of love came not from need but from choice. The house they entered was warm and welcoming, filled with furniture they had built together, and books they had chosen together, and dreams they had made reality through stubborn persistence and unwavering partnership. It was not the life either of them had planned, but it was better than anything they had dared to hope for. Outside, the prairie stretched endlessly under the star-filled sky, vast and beautiful and unforgiving. But inside their home, two people who had found each other against all odds settled into sleep with the knowledge that some fires, once properly kindled, burned, not just bright, but eternal warming, not only themselves, but everyone who came within their circle of light. The freezing bride had learned to create her own warmth, and in doing so had discovered that the best kind of rescue was the kind you accomplished together, building something that would last long after the storms had passed and the seasons had turned toward hope.